The cup was white porcelain, rimmed in a thin line of gilt that had not worn in the way cheaper gilding wore. Cecily noticed this first. She noticed it, the way she noticed most things, quietly and without announcement, and she set it in her mind beside the other thing she had noticed, which was the color of the tea inside it. The tea was slightly darker than it should have been, not enough to startle a person accustomed to thinking of tea as simply tea. Cecily's father had kept 3 shelves of botanical texts in his study, and she had read them all twice, and she knew the particular brownish depth that foxglove steeped to, and how it differed from the depth of good Indian black, and she knew that the difference was not great, but it was not nothing. Mrs. Portia Fellows had poured for them with every appearance of pleasure. The afternoon light in the Ashdale Park drawing-room fell through tall windows across the marquetry table, and the silver tea service caught it and distributed it across the walls in small, trembling coins of reflection, and Cecily sat in a chair that was worth more than her father's house, and watched Mrs. Blost. Fellows's hands steady on the pot, and said when the cup was placed before her, "What a beautiful cup! I do not think I have seen this pattern before." Mrs. Fellows blinked. The cup was small and white, pale as winter sky, and the gilt band at the rim had the particular quality of something old and kept rather than new and displayed. "Lady Marin has so many pieces," she said. "One loses track." "Of course," Cecily said. She lifted the cup. She breathed in the steam. She did not drink. She set it down again after a moment and pressed a gloved hand lightly to her collarbone, as if the warmth had been exactly pleasant, as if she had no further need of it just then. And she asked Mrs. Fellows about the gardens. Fellows, who liked to speak about the gardens, spoke about the gardens, and Lady Marin's cup was removed untasted before the old lady had brought it to her lips, because Cecily had leaned across and said gently, "My lady, I think your shawl has slipped." And in the business of the shawl, the cup was simply set aside. And Cecily had set her own unused cup beside it, in a gesture so natural it looked like tidiness. She did not show anything in her face. She had had 24 years of practice in not showing what she knew. She had arrived at Ashdale Park at the end of March, when the grounds were still bare and the sky above Wiltshire ran grey from one edge to the other, without breaking. Lady Marin Harrow had wanted a companion with some education, someone who could read aloud without stumbling, who could discuss a letter, who could manage correspondence when the old lady's eyes tired. The agency in Bath had sent 3 candidates. Lady Marin had chosen Cecily, because she said afterward, the other 2 had looked at the portraits in the entry hall without truly seeing them. Cecily had stood before the portrait of a young woman in blue, and said she has a botanist's expression. She is looking at the hydrangeas, not past them. Lady Marin had said, she was my nephew's sister. Her name was Eleanor. That had been the beginning. The household had 4 servants in winter and 6 in spring, and a cook named Mrs. Peel, who made excellent bread and disapproved of London fashions, and 2 footmen whose names were Thomas and young William, and a housekeeper, Mrs. Aldgate, who had managed the estate through 3 generations of Harrows, and wore her grey hair in a knot so precise it seemed architectural. Cecily found the household orderly and kind. She found Lady Marin intelligent and occasionally sharp, and exactly the sort of person she could love, in the quiet way she had learned to love things that were not hers to keep. Lord Ashdale himself she had not expected. She had expected a man shaped like his social position, which, in her experience, was broad at the chest and narrow in the eyes, given to receiving deference and returning very little. She had not expected a man of 34 who stood at the window of his aunt's sitting room 3 days after Cecily's arrival, and listened to Lady Marin read aloud a passage from a natural history of hedgerows, and who said, when his aunt had finished, "She is described incorrectly in the 3rd paragraph. The hedgehog does not hibernate through April." Lady Marin had said, "Cecily, is he right?" And Cecily had said, without looking up from her needlework, "He is right about April. He is wrong about mid-March, in a mild winter." There had been a pause. "Where does a solicitor's daughter learn about hedgehog hibernation?" Lord Ashdale said, and his voice was level and held no mockery. "Her father's library. Cecily said. He kept everything. He said nothing further. He left the room shortly after. She had felt his attention shift in the pause before he spoke again. The way you feel a draft shift direction, without quite knowing which window has been opened. The Fellows women arrived a fortnight into May. Mrs. Portia Fellows had been a feature of the county set for more than 20 years. The widow of Ashdale's late father's steward, a woman who had converted her husband's proximity to rank into a social currency she spent with great care and considerable expertise. She came always with her niece, Miss Delia Fellows, who was 21 years old and had a complexion like buttercream, and a habit of looking at everything in a room except the person she was addressing. She was not unkind. She was simply so thoroughly managed by her aunt that she had never needed to be anything at all of her own. The garden party was Lady Marin's idea. The spring had turned finally warm, and there were peonies along the south wall, and Lady Marin liked to see people in her garden while she could still be said to preside over it. Cecily had organized the chairs and overseen the arrangement of the refreshment table, and had done these things in a plain white muslin that was perfectly clean and utterly without ornament, because she had 3 gowns of comparable quality and she was not going to ruin one of them on a garden chair. She had stepped inside briefly to retrieve a parasol Lady Marin had asked for, and she heard Mrs. Fellows's voice from the border of the rose garden, where the hedge gave a degree of privacy that was not, in fact, complete. She is nothing more than a solicitor's daughter, with good posture, Mrs. Fellows said, and Miss Delia Fellows said, in a voice that was curious rather than cruel. She seems rather clever. Clever? Fellows, and the word was given exactly the weight of a disadvantage. Cecily retrieved the parasol and returned to Lady Marin, and said nothing. She had known she would be judged the moment the Fellows' carriage came through the park gate. She had expected it to land with more force than it did. It landed instead with a dull familiarity, like a letter she had already read. What she had not expected was Lord Ashdale. He had come in from the North Field that afternoon, still in his riding coat, and had crossed the garden without stopping to speak to anyone, except his aunt, whom he bent to briefly, before straightening again. And then he had stood at the edge of the party with a glass of lemonade. He did not drink, and looked out over the south lawn with the expression of a man who has learned that most gatherings do not require his active presence, only his visible body. Cecily was returning the parasol to the drawing-room when she passed him on the terrace steps. "Miss Vane," he said. She stopped. She had not expected him to know her name yet, with such certainty of address. "My aunt tells me you read Latin," he said. "Enough to manage the botanical texts," she said. "I do not compose in it." He looked at her for a moment. His face was all clean angles, and a jaw set somewhere between reserve and patience. And he had eyes of the particular gray-green that changes depending on what the sky is doing. "There is a text in the library," he said. "A Latin natural history. My aunt cannot read it, and has been wanting a summary for years. I should have arranged for it before this." It was not a compliment. It was closer to a directive. Cecily understood at the same time that it was both. "I will begin it tomorrow," she said. He gave a brief nod and went back to standing at the edge of the party, and she went inside, and she did not look back to see if he watched her go. Her hands, she noticed when she reached the drawing-room, were entirely steady. She could not account for the warmth that had come up in her throat. The cup that Cecily had complimented at the tea party was not an accidental compliment. She had meant what she said about the gilding. She had felt it truly, which was a quality of attention she applied to most things, and which the world had consistently read as eccentricity. What she had not known, when she said it, was that the cup would mean something. She found out 3 days later. She had gone to the library early, before breakfast, while the house was still cool and the long room smelled of beeswax and old leather. She had the Latin text open on the reading table and a dictionary at her elbow, and she was working through a passage on the marsh plants of Somerset when she heard the door at the far end of the room open and close, and then Lord Ashdale's voice, very quiet, as if he had not known she was there. It was Eleanor's, he said. She looked up. He was standing 10 feet away, his hands behind his back, looking at the window rather than at her. The cup you asked about, he said. The white one with the gilt band. It was my sister's. She collected porcelain. When she died, I gave a few pieces to my aunt, because she had loved my aunt, because I could not keep them. He stopped. He pressed his thumb briefly to his collarbone and lowered his hand. I could not look at them. Cecily sat very still. You said you found it beautiful. He said she would have liked hearing that. She had a botanist's eye, Cecily said quietly. I told Lady Marin as much when I arrived. He turned and looked at her then. Whatever he had come to the library for, it was not this conversation. He did not leave. He stood in the cool of the room and looked at her, the way she had been looking at everything since she arrived, which was carefully and without announcing what he saw. She was 22, he said. I am sorry, Cecily said. There was a silence between them that was not uncomfortable. It had weight, but weight is not discomfort. He left. Shortly afterward, she returned to her Latin. She did not look up when the door closed. She kept her eyes on the text and felt her own heartbeat, measured and steady, and understood that something in the house had shifted in its relation to her, though she could not yet say in which direction. The Latin natural history kept her occupied through the better part of May, and during that time the Fellows women made 4 visits to Ashdale Park, and during those visits Mrs. Fellows conducted herself with the gracious expertise of a woman who has studied a field of operations for years. She brought small gifts for Lady Marin. She directed Delia to play the pianoforte in the drawing-room. She ensured that Lord Ashdale's tea was always within her power to pour, and that Cecily's was placed at the far end of the table. He was never rude to her. He was never precisely attentive either. He accepted what was offered him, and looked at what he chose to look at, which was increasingly not Miss Fellows, and which this gave Mrs. Fellows a crease between her brows. She was too experienced to display in company. Cecily noticed. She noticed also the way he positioned himself at doorways when she was in the room. The way he said, once when she reached for a book on a high shelf that required a chair, I will get it for you, and did not ask which one she wanted, but looked at where her hand had been. The way he said at the end of a long afternoon, when Lady Marin had grown tired and the guests were slow to leave, Miss Vane, my aunt is fatigued, and said it to no one else, as if the fact were hers to act upon, which it was. She noticed that he never intercepted her translation work, never asked to review it, never offered a correction, unless she invited one. He had asked her once in passing whether the Latin text contained anything of interest beyond the hedgerow dispute. She had said, yes, there was a passage on the medicinal properties of common marsh plants that she thought quite fine. He had not answered immediately. He had looked at her for a moment with a particular attention that was not quite reading and not quite listening, and then he had said, I should like to see that passage when you reach it. She was aware of him in rooms the way she was aware of a window that had been opened. Not invasive, simply present, and changing the temperature of the air. The Cards' evening was at the end of May, and the drawing-room was lit warm and close, and Mrs. Metis Fellows had arranged herself beside Lady Marin, at the green baize table with the particular ease of a woman who has learned to sit as if she belongs everywhere. At a pause in the play, in a voice she calculated to carry only part way, she said to Lady Marin, I wonder, my lady, whether a solicitor's daughter is quite the companion for an estate of this consequence. Lady Marin set down her cards. Miss Vane, said Lady Marin, has translated 30 pages of a 17th century Latin botanical text that has been closed in my library for 12 years, and has also located the error in my steward's accounting ledger that has been costing me £6 a quarter since my late husband's time. She picked her cards back up. I find the question somewhat answered. Mrs. Fellows smiled, which was not the same as relenting. Of course, I meant only in terms of society. It is a small observation. Cecily said nothing. She was sitting across from Delia, and she watched the younger woman study her cards with an attention that was not entirely about cards, and she thought that the younger Miss Fellows was not wicked, only young and without a vocabulary for the situation she had been placed in. Lord Ashdale had not looked up from his own cards. His jaw had shifted, slightly, in the direction of something held. She did not see it as protection. She saw it as a man who had made a decision about what he thought and had not yet decided what to do with it. The summer library hours had become a quiet thing between them. She did not arrange it. It arranged itself. She came early because the light was best. He came because he had letters to write at the library table, and because she thought he was a man who liked to inhabit the same room as something real while he worked. He talked occasionally, in the way of someone whose thoughts arrive sideways rather than direct. He told her one morning that Eleanor had taken sick on a Tuesday and been dead by the Friday following, and that the physician had said it was a fever of the summer kind, and that he had believed this because he had wanted to, and because he had not been there. He had been in London on estate business, and when he received the express he had ridden through the night, and she had been already gone. "I have thought," he said, "that if I had been more observant, if I had spent less time in London, if I had kept a different sort of attention to the people moving through my household." "You cannot observe what you are not present to see," Cecily said. "No," he said, "but one can choose to be present." She looked at him. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the window, and his face held the gray-green steady. And she understood that this was what it looked like when he held something that had no resolution. A man who had been carrying a question for 2 years, and had no answer, and had learned to carry the weight of that, rather than set it down. She thought of Eleanor's cup on its new shelf. She thought of what it meant that he had given it away, and what it meant that he had spent 2 years looking at its absence, and she understood, with the quiet precision that was her particular form of attention, that the guilt he carried was not the guilt of a man who had failed to act. It was the guilt of a man who had not known he was failing to see. "She would have liked you," he said. She liked people who did not ornament their thinking. Cecily had ornamented her. Thinking for the better part of her life, she had learned to do it. She had learned to produce a smaller, simpler version of what she knew in rooms where the larger version was not welcome. And she felt sitting across from him in the library morning the particular ache of a constraint that had been worn so long it had begun to feel like character. She had been engaged once in the early part of her 22nd year to a man named Cartwright, who had a small property in Gloucester and who had told her she was the most interesting woman he had ever spoken with. He had told 3 of his friends that she was an eccentric little creature, charming in a schoolroom sense. She had been standing behind a curtain when he said it, and she had understood, with a precision that left no room for grief to arrive quickly, that the intelligence he praised to her face was the same quality he found diminishing when he described her to men whose opinion he valued. She had ended the engagement the following morning. She had never told anyone why. If you have stayed with this story until now, I am glad of it. Cecily has spent a long time keeping her own counsel. She is about to stop. The June dinner was the largest gathering Lady Marin had attempted since the previous autumn. Mr. Quincy Lorne had come up from Salisbury, an old friend of the family, solid as a reference volume and nearly as useful. There were 8 other county neighbors, and the Fellows' women, and Lord Ashdale at the head of the table. Cecily had learned, before the dinner, from young Thomas the footman, that Mrs. Fellows had said to 3 of the assembled guests in the anteroom that a solicitor's daughter, however well-mannered, could not be expected to understand the responsibilities attached to Ashdale Park. Thomas reported this as information. He had been in the household since boyhood, and his loyalties were long and specific. Cecily had thanked him and gone upstairs to dress, and she had sat for a moment on the edge of her bed in the room she had occupied for 3 months, and she had felt the familiar small collapse of a thing named. Not unexpected. Named. She had gone down to the drawing-room and taken her place, and had been gracious. She was always gracious. She had learned very young that graciousness was the one form of power available to a woman who held no other kind, and she had wielded it with the precision of someone who understood its limits and did not exceed them. 3 evenings before the dinner, the situation had declared itself. She had gone downstairs after Lady Maren retired, intending to retrieve a book from the drawing room. The evening tea service was still laid. Mrs. Selten. Fellows had poured that evening, insisting with great warmth upon the privilege, and Lady Maren had been tired and had not drunk her cup fully before being helped upstairs by Cecily and Mrs. Aldgate. The cups were still on the table. Cecily stood in the drawing-room doorway in the yellow candlelight and looked at them. And she thought about the botanical text she had been working through for weeks. And she thought about a passage she had read in her father's library when she was 16. And she crossed to the table and lifted Lady Maren's cup and held it to the candle. The color was wrong. Not badly wrong. Not wrong in a way that announced itself. Wrong in a way that required knowing what to look for, and she knew what to look for. She stood there for a moment with the candle in one hand and the cup in the other, and she was completely still. And what she felt was not panic, but something older and colder. The understanding that she had been looking at this for 3 weeks, and had not known what she was seeing. And that the not knowing had not been stupidity, but the ordinary failure of attention to assign meaning to what has no apparent context. The color was the color of foxglove, steeped, not enough to be sudden, not of violence, a slow unkindness, the kind that permits itself to be mistaken for natural decline. Lady Maren had been tired for 2 weeks. Her hands had trembled at the cards. Cecily had attributed this to age, because age was the evident explanation, and she had not been looking for another. She was looking now. She returned the cup to the table and stood for a moment longer, thinking about what she knew and what she could prove and what was required of her. The candle guttered slightly in a draught from the hall, and the light moved across the silver tea service in a slow, rolling way, and she stood very still and breathed and let herself feel, for one clear moment, the full weight of what she was holding. She thought about Lady Maren's hands at the card table. She thought about the slight tremor in them that had come on, over the fortnight, the particular way the old lady had set her teacup down, a second earlier than she ought, as if the cup had grown heavy. She thought about the way Mrs. Aldgate had noticed and had attributed it to the heat of summer and had said nothing because there was nothing to say about a fact that appeared to have no cause. She was 24 years old, and she was a solicitor's daughter with a botanist's education and good posture, and she was about to do the only thing her intelligence had ever been worth. She went to the library. He was still there. He worked late, often she had learned this. The fire was low and he was at the writing table, with a ledger open and a candle at his elbow, and he looked up when she entered, and whatever he read in her face made him set down his pen. "Miss Vane," he said. She closed the door behind her. She was aware that this was a transgression of propriety, and she did not care. She stood before his writing table, and she told him, in plain sentences, what she had observed 3 evenings ago at the drawing-room tea service, and the 2 evenings before that, when she had watched and thought she might be mistaken, and tonight, when the cup had told her she was not. She told him about foxglove. She told him what she had read and what the color indicated. She told him that she could not be certain that she was a solicitor's daughter with her father's library, and not a physician, but that she was as close to certain as she knew how to be. She told him that Lady Maren had not drunk deeply from the cup these 3 evenings, partly by luck, and partly because Cecily had, where she could, managed the tea service toward distraction. She set her hands at her sides, and she did not look away from him, and she said, "I may be wrong. I ask you to determine that for yourself. If I am right, then something must be done." He was very still, the kind of stillness she had learned to read in him, as full attention rather than emptiness. He looked at her for a long moment, and she watched him fit something into a shape he had not known was waiting for it. "Eleanor," he said softly. "I do not know," she said. "I cannot say. I only know what I have seen these 3 evenings, and I have told you all of it." He rose from the table. "Go to bed," he said. "Lock your door." It was a directive rather than a comfort. She heard the care in it anyway. "I will send for Lorne in the morning," he said. "I need you to write down everything you observed, every evening, every detail, as precisely as you are able."
"I will have it ready by 6,
she said. He looked at her. She was aware, very suddenly and without warning, of the distance between them, which was perhaps 4 feet, and of the way the firelight changed the gray-green of his eyes to something warmer and less managed, and of her own breath, which was slower than she had expected it to be. "You came and told me," he said. "It was not a question. It was something closer to a reckoning." "Yes," she said. "Most people," he said, and stopped. He started again. "Most people in your position would have said nothing. Would have thought it was not their place." "It is precisely my place," she said. "I am Lady Marin's companion. There is nothing in my employment that supersedes her safety." He stood looking at her for another moment, and she did not move. And then he said, "Go to bed." Miss Vane, she went. The written account she left on the library table at 6 in the morning. She sat in her room for 3 hours after, and read her botanical text, and heard the sound of a horse being brought around in the courtyard below. And she thought about what she had done, and whether she had been right, and she concluded that she had been right, and that even if she had been wrong, she would do it again. Which was a clarity she had not expected to arrive at so quietly. The dinner was arranged for Saturday. Mr. Lorne had come up from Salisbury by Thursday evening. She knew he was in the house. She did not see him, but she heard his voice from the library. Level and deliberate, and she heard Lord Ashdale's voice in answer, and the door of the library was closed. On Friday evening, Mrs. Fellows received a private communication from Lord Ashdale. Cecily did not know what it said. She saw Mrs. Fellows at breakfast on Saturday, and Mrs. Sale. Fellows was composed, which was not the same as easy, and the composure had the particular quality of a woman who has gathered herself to face something that she had not anticipated would come so directly. Saturday was warm and clear, and the dining room at Ashdale Park held 14 people around a table set with the silver that had been in the Harrow family for 3 generations. Lady Marin sat to the right of her nephew and looked, Cecily thought, better than she had looked in a fortnight. The drawing-room tea service had been arranged differently for 2 days, and Mrs. Saeed Aldgate had overseen the evening cups personally. Mrs. Fellows sat 4 places from the head of the table, and her face was a composed and careful thing, and she spoke when spoken to, and maintained every appearance of ease. Mr. Fersen Lorne sat 3 seats from Lord Ashdale and said very little. The dinner was excellent. The conversation managed itself around music and the condition of the roads and the midsummer fair that was being arranged in the village. It was after the second remove that Lord Ashdale set down his wine-glass and let the table settle into its own quiet, and said into that quiet, without raising his voice, "I have a matter I wish to address before we proceed further." The table turned to him. This was what a table did when a viscount chose to speak in that tone. It simply turned. "I have learned, this week, that someone in this household has been adding a preparation of foxglove to Lady Marin's evening tea," he said. "I have the testimony of my aunt's companion, which is precise and detailed, and which Mr. Sadding Lorne has examined. I have also retrieved the cup from the Thursday evening service which was not washed, and which Mr. Lorne has had assessed by a physician of his acquaintance. The assessment confirms what Miss Vane observed." He did not look at Mrs. Fellows. Mrs. Fellows looked very briefly at Cecily. The quantity was not sufficient to cause an immediate crisis, Lord Ashdale continued. It would have caused a gradual weakening, a decline that a physician might attribute to age. It was patient, and it was deliberate, and it was intended to go unnoticed. The table was entirely silent. "I do not intend to pursue this matter in a court of law," he said, as the harm was intercepted before it was completed, "and as I prefer, for my aunt's sake, a resolution that does not require her to endure a public proceeding." He did pause. "Then Mrs. Fellows will be leaving the county. This is a conclusion that has been reached through her own agreement, which Mr. Lorne witnessed yesterday morning." Mrs. Fellows said nothing. Her hands, Cecily saw, were folded very precisely on the edge of the table, and she was looking at the centerpiece with the attention of a woman whose entire social identity is being dismantled in front of 14 people and who understands that there is no available response to this that will not cost more than silence. Delia had gone quite pale. She looked once at her aunt, then she looked at her plate. "Miss Vane," Lord Ashdale said, and now he did look across the table, past the candelabra, directly at her, "brought this matter to my attention at considerable personal cost." She had no certainty of being believed. She had no certainty of how the information would be used. She came to me, and she reported what she had seen. And she gave me an account of such accuracy and such care that I knew within the first reading what it had required of her to write it. He looked at her for another moment. "I am grateful." The table was very still. "There is one further matter," he said, and his voice did not shift in register, but something in the room shifted around it, the way a room shifts when a window is finally opened. "Miss Vane is the woman I intend to marry." He said it as he said most things, at a level and measured pace that held its own authority, and the words landed in the quiet of the room, and did not need to be repeated. Cecily sat very still. She was aware of the candelabra between them, and of Mr. Bram's, Lorne setting his wine-glass down with a small quiet sound, and of Lady Marin's hands folded on the table and the small particular smile that moved across her face and settled there like something she had been waiting to set down. She was aware of her own hands, open on her lap. She had expected to feel something complicated. What she felt was very simple and warm, and did not announce itself as anything more than the ordinary fact of being seen. He was still looking at her, she said in a voice that was steady and quiet, and contained everything she had been carrying, for 3 months and a longer time before that. "Then I accept." Someone at the far end of the table inhaled. Someone else said something low to the person beside them. Delia looked up. She looked at Cecily for a long moment, and what was in her face was not anger, but something between resignation and something Cecily could only name as relief, as if the management she had been placed under had, at last, lifted from her. Lord Ashdale poured himself a fresh glass of wine and took a drink and said to his neighbor on the left, "The pheasant is excellent. Mrs. Peel has outdone herself." And the dinner resumed. The following morning was a Sunday in late June, with the light coming early and sharp through the east-facing windows, and Cecily rose before Lady Marin was awake and went to the library. He was there as she had known he would be. He was standing at the window, and he turned when she came in. She crossed to him. She stopped within arm's reach, and he looked at her in the June morning light, and she felt her own heartbeat, which had been steady and measured, and was now something else, something warmer and less managed. And she thought, with the last remnant of the habit she had kept for 24 years, that she ought to say something sensible. She said nothing at all. He raised one hand and he touched her face, just the edge of it, one gloved finger at her jaw, and she felt the warmth of it through the kid leather. And she looked up at him, and his eyes in the morning light were the gray-green of the river at midsummer, and he said, "Cecily." It was the first time he had used her given name. He said it as if it had been waiting in his mouth for some weeks, and she understood that it had. She reached up and set her hand over his, and she held it there. The library was very quiet. Outside the window, the south lawn ran green and open in the morning sun, and somewhere in the distance a wood pigeon made its unhurried sound, and the house breathed around them in its old slow way. And neither of them moved, and neither of them needed to. Lady Marin improved through July and into August. Mrs. Aldgate oversaw the tea service with a scrupulousness that was, Cecily thought, the old housekeeper's particular expression of loyalty, and Lady Marin's hand steadied, and the color came back to her face. And she took her chair in the garden on the warm afternoons, and sat in the sun with Cecily beside her and talked about Eleanor. She talked about Eleanor the way one talks about a person who has been grieved for properly, and now lives in a different register, with warmth, with the quiet specificity of real remembrance. She described the way Eleanor had arranged her porcelain collection on a shelf in the south corridor, by height and then by age of manufacture, and how she had known the provenance of each piece, and had explained them to anyone who would listen. "She would have liked you very much," Lady Marin said. Cecily thought of a man saying those same words to a window. She thought of 2 years of guilt, and the particular quality of a person who has learned to look, and what it had cost him to sit with not knowing, and what it had cost her to walk into a library at night and speak. She thought of a white porcelain cup with a gilt band at the rim. The cup was on a different shelf now. Lord Ashdale had asked, quietly, whether Cecily might choose where it should go, and she had put it in the south corridor with the rest of Eleanor's collection, where it belonged, where it could be seen. The banns were read in September. Mr. Pat. Lorne was present for the reading, as he was present for most of the estate's formal occasions, and he looked upon the proceedings with the expression of a man who has handled the legal machinery of a family for many years and is satisfied for once that it is working in the right direction. Delia had removed to Bath with a distant cousin in August, and Cecily had learned through a brief note that arrived in early September that she was studying music and finding the removal, on the whole, something of a relief. The autumn came cold and clear over Wiltshire, and the leaves went early on the great chestnuts along the park drive. And the evening fires were lit, and on the first Sunday in October, Cecily sat in the drawing-room at Ashdale Park with Lady Marin dozing in the chair beside her, and the fire settled low and warm. And Lord Ashdale came in from the estate and sat across from her without speaking, and she looked up from her book, and looked at him, and he looked back at her. The south corridor shelf was visible through the open door, and Eleanor's cup sat on it, in the firelight, white and gold and particular, the gilt at the rim, exactly as it had been when a girl collected it, and as it would be long after. He reached across and set his hand over hers on the arm of the chair, and she turned her hand and held his, and neither of them said anything, and the fire burned, and Lady Marin breathed her slow sleeping breath, and outside the long windows the Wiltshire evening came down over the park. And the night was quiet, and the cup was home. If Cecily's story has stayed with you, leave a word in the comments. She is grateful for every person who stayed to see her scene.